Souls games are some of my absolute favorites ever. Every time I see a game labeled as a Souls-like, I immediately find myself interested in that game. I mean, I did an entire analysis on why Souls games are so addictive, which you should watch too, and I've decided to make a video about the best Souls-like games I've personally played. I've compiled a list of 10 games. Now, I'm sure there's plenty more out there, but these 10 happen to be the ones that make me very, very excited to talk about. To me, a Souls-like is a game that utilizes similar mechanics and gameplay loop styles to FromSoftware's Dark Souls. Basically, these things include smaller enemies, big and punishing boss fights, hard and addictive gameplay, reset points like a bonfire, and a disconnected narrative. There's also elements of role-playing, and for the most part, the game details a very dark world and story at the center of the entire thing. Of course, there's more to Souls games than just that, but these seem to be the most common and identifiable features. For me, I'm not going to look at other FromSoftware games like Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring on this list, not because they're not Souls-likes, because they technically are, but I also like to see what other studios and developers do with the idea of being a Souls-like and the inspirational pieces from FromSoftware's designs that they use. Just to note, this list isn't in any particular order. I'm willing to play these games all likely as much as each other. Alright, that was a pretty long intro, so let's just get right into the list. Probably the best example of a Souls-like is Lies of P, a game that basically encapsulates the FromSoftware formula, the best of any game I've played recently that can call itself a Souls-like. If I didn't know that Lies of P was a game made by NeoWiz and not FromSoftware, I might have honestly thought it was a FromSoftware game. Lies of P took the inspiration it needed from the Souls genre and developed it in a way that worked really well for it as a game. Its combat resembles Sekiro in a way with its constant block and parrying system, its vibes feel very in line with Bloodborne, and it generally has the consistent feel that a Souls game usually has. Lies of P is an alternative telling of the story of Pinocchio, who must uncover what happened to the city of Krat after the puppets made by Geppetto start turning on everyone and going on murderous rampages. Along the way, Pinocchio finds many new enemies and bosses to contend with. Overall, the game is a challenging one. It did get some rebalancing early on in its release cycle, but not for all bosses. In addition to this, Lies of P has some of my personal favorite boss fights and has some absolutely amazing character designs and visuals. As far as Souls-likes come, Lies of P understands what it means to be a Souls-like. I personally enjoyed this game a lot, and I think it really has that challenge accomplishment factor that I look for in this genre of games. Whenever I beat a hard or challenging boss, I found it very exciting because when I won, it felt significantly more accomplishing than other easier games. If you're looking for a game that feels like FromSoftware without being FromSoftware, then Lies of P is a perfect game for you. If you're looking for a cool dark fantasy title to play that has a lot of challenge and unique visuals to it, go for Lies of P. It's an absolutely fantastic game. I know that these two are separate games, but Remnant from the Ashes and Remnant 2 are still in the same series and their gameplay is not really that different from each other, so I decided to just list them in the same section together. Remnant from the Ashes is a game that is inspired by Souls-likes, but involves weapons like guns, not just melee components like many other Souls-likes out there. That makes it a very unique addition, as the only other Souls game I can think of that includes guns is Bloodborne. The Remnant series is about your player character as you try to survive a post-apocalyptic world that has been overtaken by an enemy force called the Root. There's also co-op in this game, so you can play with other people if the game gets a bit tough sometimes. Remnant from the Ashes includes lots of unique and interesting enemies to fight, and it also has some very similar mechanics to the Dark Souls games. You can dodge and roll the way you would in Dark Souls, which is something I used a lot in this game. The game is also in third person, but it has some cool things like weapons mods that act almost like a magic system in the game. These come in handy a lot during boss fights. The world is randomly generated in certain areas, but there's still a set story in place in Remnant from the Ashes. Remnant 2 is relatively similar to Remnant from the Ashes in that you need to fight against the Root, and it includes much of the same game elements and mechanics. Both Remnant games encapsulate an interesting take on the third-person shooter genre and the Souls genre, and combine both in a very cool way for Souls-like games. These are, of course, respawn points that act like bonfires from Dark Souls, there are dungeons that you go through, small enemies that are easier to beat, and more difficult enemies that spawn to attack you. For the most part, I found that both Remnant games were a lot of fun and a very unique take on the Souls-like definition. In fact, I'd heard that it was inspired by Souls-likes, but I didn't know how much until I got to the Mist in the first boss battle and audibly said, "Oh, this is one of those games." and I proceeded to get very excited about it. I talked about Hollow Knight in my Souls-like analysis, but I'm also going to mention it here because as far as Souls-likes go, Hollow Knight is one of the first people mentioned to define this genre of games. Now there is some debate online about whether or not Hollow Knight is a Souls-like, but for all intensive purposes I do consider it one for a couple of reasons. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania game that puts you in the place of a small bug, which is a knight, who must figure out what happened to Hollow Nest after it was plagued by a mysterious disease. Much of the game feels very in line with Souls-likes in that it has multiple aspects that are very similar to Souls-likes. For one, it has benches that act as rest and respawn points, challenging combat, boss fights, and unique spells that allow for more variety in the gameplay. For the most part, Hollow Knight really showcases how a Souls-like can take on a very different form. The previous games I talked about were very close in look and gameplay style to Souls games, but Hollow Knight is totally different. As a 2D side-scrolling Metroidvania, it has a different vibe and a different feel to it in comparison to that of games like Lies of P and Remnant. However, that does Hollow Knight a service in that it shows how the Souls-like term can be applied to many different forms of games. For me, Hollow Knight is one of those games that you can't forget about after playing. It has a very unique feel and a very unique vibe to it that other games just don't have. I also find that it's a really good platformer as well, and I've played quite a few platformers before, but there's just something about Hollow Knight that sticks out to me the most. I can't really put it into words, but if you play the game, I think you'll automatically know what I mean. I think Hollow Knight is one of the most well-made indie games that you can play as well, and it clearly shows that the devs over at Team Cherry care a lot about their game and the fans who enjoy the game as well, so I 100% recommend and encourage everyone to give Hollow Knight a shot because it's a fantastic title. Mortal Shell was one of the first Souls-like games I had tried after Dark Souls, and it is likely one of the most recognizably Souls-like titles on this list. However, there are a few interesting distinctions between Mortal Shell and FromSoftware titles from a general perspective. In Mortal Shell, you play as a sort of weird creature that takes on armor and skins which are called shells. These shells grant you protection and abilities as you go throughout the map and fight various enemies and bosses provided to you in the game. You can go through the entire game without picking up a shell once, and if you beat the game, you'll actually get a special achievement for that. But the game is overall built in a bit of a similar yet different way to most Souls-like games, but it did want to go back to the basics of the Souls style. The team that developed Mortal Shell explained that they designed 4 shells with their own playstyles and backstories in order to make up for their limited team's ability to develop and design a lot of pieces of armor like FromSoftware games. They also wanted to create a more deep and emotional experience in a video game by designing a bleak and damaged world. In my opinion, I think that Mortal Shell is a challenging game that really encompasses the challenging aspect that makes most Souls-like games the way that they are. However, it also has an interesting style and take on the idea of being a Souls-like with its combat playstyles and look, and it definitely feels like it goes back to the more basic elements of being a Souls game. I know that some games aren't for everyone, but if you're looking for an experience similar to FromSoftware, but a little less than like Lies of P, then Mortal Shell is certainly a good pick for you. Blasphemous is another game I mentioned in my Souls-like analysis video, and I think that it's also one of the best on this list as well. Well, I think all of these games on this list are great, but you get what I mean. Blasphemous includes some of the most interesting imagery from a game I've seen in a while. Its take on a Catholic-style Spain is very different from other video games that use religious iconography and imagery. In Blasphemous, the religious symbolism and iconography are very integrated and well baked into the world of the game and the lore. Additionally, there's a very sinister yet deep feel to this world of Custodia that the penitent one has to go through as he undertakes a pilgrimage. Blasphemous has a similar gameplay style to Hollow Knight, seeing as it is also a Metroidvania. It's also likened to being a Souls-like because of its dark and bleak world, difficult boss fights and combat, and just all around being like a Souls-like with things like the respawn points, magic system, healing system, and more. In my honest opinion, Blasphemous has a lot going for it beyond just being a Souls-like. Being a Metroidvania, it's similar to Hollow Knight in being a more unique style of the Souls-like genre. However, it does hold up as a different experience than Hollow Knight and other Souls-likes because it has a pixelated art style and its own interesting imagery that works very well for it. Some people weren't a huge fan of the Metroidvania combat or the platforming in Blasphemous, but I do think that it's a great game and it does have a lot of of interesting elements to it. I like Blasphemous for those reasons, but the thing that personally drew me into this game was the unique art style. I always appreciate when a game can integrate things well and create for itself kind of a unique, interesting look. Nioh is a very clear example of a Souls-like game inspired by the formula of FromSoftware's game lineup. Set in Japan in the year 1600, Nioh is about an Irish sailor named William Adams who became a samurai. The game features fighting against yokai or demons who are beginning to encroach and invade the sanctity of the nation. The developers at Team Ninja were major fans of Dark Souls and were very much inspired by the Souls formula to create Nioh. Having previously worked on Ninja Gaiden as well, Team Ninja wanted to make a difficult yet also fair and rewarding game for players, something that is often seen in many Souls-likes. The combat was heavily influenced by Dark Souls and the loot system was influenced more by Diablo, but overall Nioh is very much a Souls-like that fans of Dark Souls and other FromSoftware games would definitely enjoy. Another cool and interesting element about Nioh is sticking to historical accuracy with things like the weapons and armor, which I'm sure is something that some people really do value. I personally am not a stickler about historical accuracy and everything when it comes to video games because they are games at the end of the day and I just want to have fun with them, but I do appreciate when developers do proper research in creating their games. Nioh 2 is relatively similar to Nioh 1 except that it features a character who was a yokai that you get to design. However, both games understood the influence of Dark Souls well and created a very unique and fun gameplay system that was also rewarding to play through. The bosses are considered pretty difficult, but in the true Souls-like fashion, that's just part of the learning process in playing these sorts of games. One of my favorite Metroidvania games ever made, Dead Cells is a game that I would consider to be an 11 out of 10 on any scale in any aspect. The game has been my obsession since I first tried it, and I play it whenever I'm bored, want to have fun, or really in any circumstances. I just really enjoy Dead Cells. In a way, Dead Cells is less Souls-like than Hollow Knight or Blasphemous, but it still borrows heavily on Souls-like elements, and it even references those other games through cool Easter eggs like the Hollow Knight bench and the Penitent One outfit you can get in the game. Dead Cells is more roguelike than Souls-like, but to me, it has a lot of a Souls-like feel to it as well. The combat isn't too particularly challenging all the time, but it's the variety of combat that can get challenging. Different enemies require different tactics, there are challenging and awesome boss fights, there are cool weapons that you can choose from, and a bit of magic sprinkled in there. The chance of death is very high, and when you do die, you lose all of the cells you acquire from killing enemies and have to recollect them again. The one thing that I would say truly differentiates Dead Cells from other Souls-like Metroidvanias is the fact that when you die, you go back to the beginning of the entire map. You don't spawn at a nearby point, which is why this game is more roguelike than Souls-like. However, I do think there are similarities to the Souls-like genre, so from my perspective, I'll consider it one. Dead Cells has a very interesting lore to it as well, and it's something that you uncover as you go throughout the game. In any case, to even understand the idea of the game, you need to die at least once to unlock certain dialogue. When you're first starting out, there's less information given to you, and as you go, you learn more about the island you're on and the mission you need to undertake to free the island from the king. Star Wars games being considered Souls-likes is not something I would have even thought possible until Jedi Fallen Order came out. Even before I was super familiar with the definition of a Souls-like game, I had already likened the game in a way to the Souls-like formula I had seen in Dark Souls. Challenging combat, respawn points that reset all smaller enemies, tough boss fights, magic, limited healing, these things are all things that heavily reminded me of Dark Souls. A lot of the boss fights pose an actual challenge, especially if you turn up the difficulty. This is a difference between this game and other Souls-likes though, because changing the difficulty does defeat the purpose of a Souls-like being challenging, but if you do want it to feel like a real Souls-like experience, then making the game's difficulty high does allow for that to happen, and you can change it at any point in the game. Another element that does differentiate Jedi Fallen Order from being a Souls-like is the fact that it has a very clear and deep-rooted story that matters to the game a lot more than you see in games like Dark Souls. I mean, it is a Star Wars game, but you can see that there was a heavy influence from Dark Souls on the combat style of this game. That might be one of the reasons why I immediately decided that I liked the game. In terms of the sequel, Jedi Survivor, it's relatively the same in the combat scheme, but there are more improvements. Death's Door is a game that I found to be really cool and unique, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. Death's Door is about a crow soul reaper that must go through certain doors that put you into new maps, and your objective is to reap souls from these big bosses. Death's Door works a lot with the aspect of puzzles, forcing you to explore the different routes to find keys and unlock doors in order to fight against enemies and bosses. The game is very much in line with the style of Soulslikes, offering a heavy emphasis on dodging and rolling, melee combat, a slight magic system, respawn points, intense boss fights, and more. The boss fights also didn't seem to have health bars, if that gives you any indication on what this game is going to be like. However, there are patterns that you memorize to the boss fights, which is pretty similar to how Dark Souls is, where you just memorize the enemy's attack patterns. Still, again, like Dark Souls, the enemy can change up their attack patterns. For me, Death's Door was a pleasant surprise. I wasn't sure what to expect going into it, but I found myself really liking it. As far as an indie Souls-like, it's a great one that has a lot of very familiar combat mechanics and a very familiar look and style. And as a fan of indie games, I definitely recommend Death's Door, especially if you're always on the hunt for a new Souls-like and a new indie game. Wulong Fallen Dynasty is a game that released not too long ago and feels very similar in look and style to FromSoftware's games. Wulong allows you to design your own character and utilizes very similar mechanics to most Souls-likes, such as hard melee combat, a dark dystopian-ish world, and a magic system. Wulong isn't my personal favorite game of all time, but as far as Souls-likes come, it's not too bad. It was made by the same team behind Nioh, so they already have a knowledge of what it means to create a Souls-like before even going into Wulong. Wulong is about your player character who's unnamed as they live throughout a fictitious version of the fall of the Han Dynasty and battle against historical figures, as well as demons known as Qi who have corrupted the mythological Chinese creatures present in the game. The combat system is pretty good, and the game even includes something unique for the Souls-like genre, which is the morale system. This system allows for you to enter battles with a higher morale, making fighting against tougher bosses easier than it would normally be without such a system. This is different from other Souls-likes for sure, as it does take away a bit of that grueling, punishing feeling that most Souls-likes tend to have. Critics really liked Wulong and found that it does fix a lot of stuff present in Nioh. However, it does seem to be a bit lacking in performance on the PC version, but that wasn't really seen in the console version. I feel like these 10 Souls-likes really do take a broad stroke from across many forms and genres to curate a pretty diverse list. A lot of these games are on my list of personal favorite games, and I didn't list anything on here that I would rate below a 7 out of 10. Personally, I find games like Wulong Fallen Dynasty are easier for people who aren't so used to Souls-likes. Nioh is great for people that want a bit more of an arcadey approach, while games like Lies of P provide excellent challenges for those who are used to playing Souls-likes a lot. Whatever it is, I definitely recommend every game on this list, and I especially recommend the Metroidvanias like Hollow Knight, because those games are great and very accessible to many players while still maintaining some of that challenge seen in games like Dark Souls. If you're wondering which of these games are available through Game Pass, I'll list them right now. So they are Lies of P, Remnant 1 and 2, Hollow Knight, Dead Cells, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, Death's Door, and Wulong Fallen Dynasty. If you want to play Blasphemous, Nioh, and Mortal Shell, you'll have to get those ones separately. Let me know in the comments below what other Souls-likes you enjoy and what your personal favorite from this list is. And with that being said, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe with notifications set to all so you never miss out on a single upload. Don't forget to like this video and check out our website for gaming news, entertainment, and more. The link to that, as well as all our other important links, are in the description below. See you all in the next video.